Colorado Territory, 1869. The snow fell in heavy sheets across the foothills of the Rockies, blanketing the rugged landscape in a treacherous white. Cale Pemberton hunched forward in his saddle, squinting against the biting wind as he urged his mount through the deepening drifts. At 25, he'd already spent 7 years working cattle and had the lean, muscled frame to prove it. His clean-shaven face was weathered beyond his years, testament to days spent under the harsh western sun and nights enduring bitter cold like this. "Just a little further, Duster," he murmured to his horse, adjusting the worn leather hat that shielded his eyes from the worst of the storm. "Ranch is just beyond that ridge." The double P wasn't much, a modest cabin, a sturdy barn, and grazing land that stretched toward the mountains, but it was his. 3 years of backbreaking work after saving every penny he'd earned pushing cattle for the larger outfits. Independence had cost him dearly, but Cale believed a man needed to stand on his own in this untamed country. The frontier was no place for softness. His father had taught him that lesson when Cale was just 10 years old, watching their family's Kansas farm burn at the hands of raiders. His mother and sister hadn't survived. His father lasted only 2 years more before consumption took him, leaving Cale alone at 12. The lesson had been seared into his soul. Attachment was vulnerability, and vulnerability got you killed in the West. Better to rely on no one. Better to need nothing but your own 2 hands and your wits. Cale had built his small ranch on that belief, content with the company of his horses, the few cattle he managed, and occasionally his nearest neighbor, old Jim Thornton, whose property bordered his to the south. The wind shifted suddenly, carrying a sound that didn't belong. Cale reined in, cocking his head. There it came again, not the howl of the storm, but something higher, more desperate, a cry. "Whoa, boy," he murmured, patting Duster's neck. The gelding's ears pricked forward. Cale hesitated. The storm was worsening. Whoever was out in this weather was likely beyond help, and risking himself would be foolish. The sensible thing would be to continue home and check once the blizzard passed. But the sound came again, unmistakably human, and something buried deep beneath layers of hard-earned stoicism responded. With a quiet curse, Cale turned Duster away from the path home. Tracking the sound through the storm proved difficult, but after nearly 20 minutes of careful navigation through snow-covered rocks and trees, Cale spotted a dark shape against the white. As he drew closer, the shape resolved into an overturned wagon, one wheel splintered beyond repair, its canvas covering torn and flapping in the wind. "Hello," he called, dismounting carefully and approaching with one hand near his revolver. "Anybody there?" A whimper drew his attention to the far side of the wagon. Rounding it cautiously, he found a figure huddled against the broken vehicle, nearly covered in snow. It was a woman. Young, perhaps 19 or 20, with waves of rich brown hair escaping from beneath a woolen bonnet. Her face, though pale with cold, held a delicate beauty that seemed entirely out of place in the brutal landscape. She wore a blue wool dress now sodden with snow and clutched a small bundle to her chest. Her eyes, a startling hazel, widened at the sight of him. "Please," she whispered through chattering teeth. "Help us." Cale crouched beside her, noticing how she protectively held the bundle. With a jolt, he realized it contained a baby, swaddled in layers but frighteningly still. "What happened?" he asked, already shrugging out of his heavy coat. "Wheel broke," she managed. "My husband, he went for help yesterday, never came back." Cale's jaw tightened as he draped his coat around her shoulders. A man who'd leave his wife and child alone in such conditions was either dead or not worth finding. Given the ferocity of the storm, he suspected the former. "I'm Cale Pemberton," he said. "My ranch is about a mile from here. Can you ride?" Hope flickered in her eyes. "Faith," she said, her voice barely audible over the wind. "Faith Oaks, and this is Sarah." She shifted the bundle slightly. "I can ride if it means saving my daughter." Cale nodded, making a quick assessment. The woman Faith was clearly exhausted and half frozen, but there was a determination in her gaze that suggested she wouldn't give up easily. The baby concerned him more. Too still, too quiet. "We need to get moving." Now he helped her to her feet, supporting most of her weight. "Is there anything you need from the wagon?" Faith shook her head. "Nothing that matters." Getting them both onto Duster was awkward but manageable. Kale positioned Faith in the saddle with the baby secure against her chest, then mounted behind her, one arm holding her steady as he took the reins with his free hand. Her body trembled violently against his, but she didn't complain or make a sound beyond whispering reassurances to her silent child. The journey back to the ranch seemed interminable. The snow had deepened, and Duster struggled through drifts that reached his chest in some places. Twice they nearly lost their way, but Kale's knowledge of the terrain kept them on course. By the time the cabin came into view, Faith had grown alarmingly quiet, her head occasionally lolling back against his shoulder before she would jerk upright again, clutching her baby tighter. "Almost there," Kale said, his breath clouding in the frigid air. "Just hold on a little longer." He barely remembered getting them inside. Later he would recall snippets, the blessed warmth of the cabin as he shouldered open the door, laying Faith on his narrow bed while he hastily built up the fire, the terrifying moment when he unwrapped the baby and found her tiny face blue-tinged and unresponsive. "No," Faith had moaned, trying to rise from the bed despite her weakness. "Sarah, no." Kale had acted on instinct, rubbing the infant's limbs, breathing gently into her mouth, praying to a God he'd long since stopped believing in. When the baby finally gave a weak cry, he'd nearly collapsed with relief. The next hours passed in a blur of warming blankets, melting snow for hot water, and coaxing both mother and child to take small sips of broth from his meager stores. By nightfall, Faith had regained some color, and little Sarah was nursing weakly at her mother's breast. Kale kept his distance, tending the fire and preparing what food he could from his limited supplies. The woman's presence in his home felt like an invasion of something precious, his solitude, his carefully constructed isolation. Yet he couldn't deny the strange satisfaction he felt knowing they were safe from the storm that continued to howl outside his walls. "Thank you," Faith said quietly as he placed another cup of broth beside the bed. "You saved our lives." Kale nodded uncomfortably. "Storm's supposed to break tomorrow. Once it does, I'll head over to the Thornton place. They might know something about your husband." Her eyes clouded. "Nathan wouldn't have abandoned us willingly. Something must have happened." "Territory's dangerous in the best weather," Kale replied, more gruffly than he intended. "Blizzard like this. A man can lose his way easy." He didn't add what they both knew, that if Nathan Oakes hadn't found shelter yesterday, they wouldn't be finding him alive. Faith swallowed hard, glancing down at her sleeping daughter. "What will we do if he's gone?" The question hung in the air between them, impossible to answer. Kale busied himself with the fire, avoiding her gaze. "We'll figure something out," he said finally. "Get some rest." He spent the night in the rocking chair by the fire, listening to the soft breathing of the woman and child who had so unexpectedly invaded his sanctuary. Tomorrow, he told himself, he'd figure out how to get them to the nearest town. A young widow with a baby would find charity there. Churches took in such cases. It wasn't his concern. But as dawn broke and the storm finally began to abate, Kale found himself watching Faith as she slept, the baby nestled against her. Something stirred in his chest, an emotion he couldn't name, didn't want to acknowledge. He turned away sharply, donning his coat and stepping outside to check on the animals. The world had transformed overnight into a blinding white expanse. The snow had drifted against the cabin walls, nearly covering the lower windows. It would take hours to dig out the path to the barn. Kale sighed, reconciling himself to the fact that his unexpected guests wouldn't be leaving anytime soon. When he returned, stamping snow from his boots, Faith was awake and attempting to rise from the bed. "You should rest," he said, hanging his coat by the door. "I've imposed enough," she replied, though she sank back as a wave of dizziness clearly overtook her. "I need to find Nathan." "Not in this," Kale gestured toward the window. "Besides, you can barely stand." Faith's eyes filled with tears she seemed determined not to shed. "He's all I have, him and Sarah." Kale busied himself with rekindling the fire. "When the snow settles, I'll go look for him. Until then, you're staying put." 3 days passed before the conditions improved enough for Kale to consider venturing out to search for Nathan Oakes. During that time, a reluctant routine established itself. Faith, though still weak, insisted on helping with what chores she could manage while tending to Sarah, who grew stronger each day. Kale maintained a careful distance, speaking little, retiring early to his bedroll by the fire, but found himself increasingly aware of her presence. The soft humming as she rocked her child, the gentle way she thanked him for the simplest things, the determined set of her jaw when she spoke of finding her husband. On the morning of the fourth day, Kale saddled Duster and prepared to ride toward where Faith had left the wagon. "I want to come with you," Faith said, standing in the doorway with Sarah bundled against her chest. Kale shook his head. "It's still dangerous out there, and you're not strong enough." "He's my husband," she insisted, her hazel eyes bright with stubborn determination. "And that's your daughter," Kale countered, nodding toward the infant. "She needs you alive." Faith's resistance crumbled at that and she stepped back. "Please find him," she whispered. "I'll do what I can," Kale promised, though they both knew what he was likely to discover. The search took most of the day. Kale found the wagon where they'd left it, now nearly buried in snow. From there he followed what logic suggested would be Nathan's path toward the nearest settlement, a small mining town called Elk Ridge, about 10 miles east. 2 miles from the wagon he found what he'd been dreading, a man's body, frozen solid, half covered by drifting snow. Nathan Oakes had been young, perhaps 26, with a strong build and features that, even in death, suggested a kind disposition. No signs of violence marked him, just the terrible stillness of a man who'd succumbed to the cold while trying to save his family. Kale removed his hat, standing silently over the man for a long moment. Then, with grim determination, he wrapped the body in a blanket he'd brought for the purpose and secured it to Duster's back. Faith deserved the chance to say goodbye properly. The sun was setting by the time he returned to the cabin. Faith must have been watching for him, for she opened the door before he could dismount. Her eager expression crumbled as she saw the burden his horse carried. "No," she breathed, one hand flying to her mouth. "Oh, Nathan, no." Kale helped her back inside before she could collapse in the snow, settling her by the fire while he attended to the grim task of bringing her husband's body to the barn. There was no way to dig a proper grave with the ground frozen solid, but the cold would preserve the body until spring thaw. When he returned to the cabin, Faith sat motionless, staring into the flames. Sarah slept in a makeshift cradle fashioned from a drawer Kale had emptied and lined with blankets. "He was heading east," Kale said quietly, "toward Elk Ridge. Looks like he got caught in the worst of the storm." Faith nodded, her face eerily composed. "He would have kept going, believing he could make it. Nathan always believed things would work out if he just tried hard enough." A single tear tracked down her cheek. He was so certain coming west was the right choice. "Where were you headed?" Kale asked, removing his coat and hat. "California. Nathan had a cousin there who wrote about fruit orchards and mild winters." She gave a hollow laugh. "I was afraid of the journey, but he promised we'd find paradise at the end of it." Kale said nothing. He'd heard enough such stories to know how they typically ended. The West broke promises as easily as it broke men. "What will you do now?" he finally asked. Faith's shoulders slumped. "I don't know. We spent everything we had on the wagon and supplies." She glanced at her sleeping daughter. "I have no family back east, nowhere to return to." Kale poured coffee for them both, buying time as he wrestled with thoughts he'd rather not entertain. The sensible thing would be to take her to Elk Ridge once the trail's cleared, the decent thing. She wasn't his responsibility, just a stranger fate had thrust in his path. "You can stay here until spring," he heard himself say. "Weather will be too unpredictable for traveling with a baby before then." Faith looked up, surprise evident in her tear-streaked face. "I couldn't impose." "It's not an imposition," Kale interrupted, uncomfortable with her gratitude. "It's just practical. You need somewhere safe for the winter, and I've got the space." He gestured around the modest cabin. "It's not much, but it's shelter." "Thank you," Faith whispered. "I'll find a way to repay your kindness." Kale shrugged awkwardly. "Get some rest. Tomorrow we can see to your husband proper-like." That night, lying on his bedroll and listening to Faith's muffled crying, Kale wondered what madness had possessed him to invite a woman and child to stay for months. His carefully constructed solitude lay in ruins, and before him stretched a winter of constant company, of responsibility for lives beyond his own. The thought should have terrified him. Instead, he found himself oddly at peace with the decision, though he couldn't have explained why. The weeks that followed brought changes to the double P that Kale could never have anticipated. With Nathan laid to rest as best they could manage in the frozen ground, Faith threw herself into establishing a routine that allowed her to contribute to the household while caring for Sarah. Initially, Kale resisted her efforts, insisting she focus on regaining her strength. But Faith Oakes proved as stubborn as she was grateful, and gradually, almost imperceptibly, the cabin transformed. Meals became more than just functional sustenance. The sparse furnishings were rearranged to create distinct living spaces. Somehow, despite their limited resources, the place began to feel like a home rather than merely a shelter. For Kale, who had lived alone for so long, the adjustment was both unsettling and strangely comforting. He found himself lingering over coffee in the mornings, listening as Faith spoke of her childhood in Pennsylvania, her brief marriage to Nathan, their dreams of building a new life out west. In turn, and to his own surprise, he occasionally shared fragments of his own past, though never the darkest parts, the memories of fire and loss that had shaped his solitary nature. "You've never mentioned family," Faith remarked one evening in late January as they sat before the fire, Sarah sleeping peacefully in her drawer cradle. Outside, the wind howled, rattling the windows and reminding them of the harsh world beyond their walls. Kale stared into his coffee cup. "Don't have any, not anymore." Faith studied him with those perceptive hazel eyes that seemed to see more than he wanted to reveal. "Is that why you live all the way out here? So far from town?" "I like the quiet," he said, which wasn't exactly an answer. "No one likes quiet this much," Faith persisted gently, "not unless they're running from something." Kale's jaw tightened. "Not running. Just learned early that depending on others is a fool's game." Faith considered this, her fingers absently tracing the rim of her cup. "And yet you took us in, strangers who could only be a burden to you." "That was different," he muttered, uncomfortable with her line of questioning. "How so?" Kale stood abruptly, moving to add another log to the fire. "You needed help, simple as that." Faith smiled slightly. "I think there's more kindness in you than you like to admit, Kale Pemberton." He made a noncommittal sound, grateful when she changed the subject to more practical matters, the dwindling firewood, the need to check their food stores. But her words lingered, challenging the beliefs he'd held for so long about himself and the life he'd chosen. By February, they had settled into a companionable routine. On days when the weather permitted, Kale would tend to the livestock and hunting, bringing back what game he could find to supplement their stores. Faith kept the cabin in order and cared for Sarah, who grew stronger and more alert with each passing day. In the evenings they would sit by the fire, sometimes talking, sometimes in comfortable silence. Occasionally, Faith would sing softly, old hymns and folk songs that filled the cabin with a warmth no fire could provide. Kale found himself looking forward to those moments, though he'd never admit as much. "Have you always lived alone?" Faith asked one such evening, her voice casual as she mended one of Kale's shirts. Kale, whittling a small wooden horse, a toy for Sarah, though he hadn't acknowledged that purpose even to himself, paused briefly. "Since I was 16, worked ranch jobs before saving enough to buy this place." "That's very young to be on your own," she observed. "Had been on my own since 12, really," Kale replied, then immediately regretted the admission. He rarely spoke of those years. Faith's hands stilled. "What happened when you were 12? Kale focused intently on the piece of wood in his hands. "Father died, consumption. Mother and sister were already gone by then." "I'm so sorry," Faith said softly. "How did they?" The question hung in the air. Kale considered deflecting it, changing the subject as he always did when conversation veered too close to those memories. But something about the quiet cabin, the gentle presence of this woman who had endured her own tragedy with such grace, loosened the tight control he maintained over his past. Raiders, he said finally, during the war. Border country was lawless. They came for our horses, supplies. Father was away. He swallowed hard. They burned the house with my mother and sister inside. Faith's hand flew to her mouth, her eyes wide with horror. Kale, long time ago, he interrupted, not wanting her pity. Made me understand what kind of world this is, that's all. A world where terrible things happen, Faith acknowledged. But also a world where a stranger rides through a blizzard to save a woman and her baby. Kale said nothing, continuing his carving with renewed focus. After a moment, Faith spoke again, her voice thoughtful. My mother used to say that pain either opens your heart or seals it shut. The choice belongs to each of us. Sounds like something mothers say, Kale replied, but there was no edge to his words. Faith smiled sadly. I hope to be wise enough to say such things to Sarah someday. They fell silent then, the only sounds the crackle of the fire and the soft whisper of Faith's needle through fabric. But something had shifted between them, a wall lowered if not entirely removed. As February gave way to March, the worst of winter's grip began to loosen. The days grew incrementally longer, the snow began to recede, and with the changing season came a subtle transformation in Kale himself. He found himself watching Faith more often. The graceful way she moved about the cabin, the tender care she showed her daughter, the quiet strength with which she faced her grief. Sometimes he would catch her looking at him too, a speculative expression in those hazel eyes that made him both uncomfortable and strangely hopeful. One morning, returning from tending the animals, Kale found Faith standing in the doorway of the cabin, Sarah bundled in her arms, both of them gazing at the brilliant blue sky. First truly beautiful day we've had, Faith remarked as he approached. Sarah should feel the sunshine on her face. Kale nodded, suddenly struck by how right they looked there, framed in the doorway of his home. The thought disturbed him enough that he busied himself with removing his coat and gloves, avoiding Faith's gaze. I've been thinking, she said, following him inside. When spring truly arrives, I should find work in town. Save enough to move on by summer. Kale froze in the act of hanging his coat. The idea of Faith and Sarah leaving had been an abstract future event, something he hadn't allowed himself to consider in concrete terms. Now faced with the reality of their departure, he felt an unexpected hollowness in his chest. That makes sense, he said, his voice carefully neutral. Elk Ridge is growing. Might be opportunities there. Faith nodded, but her expression suggested she'd expected, or perhaps hoped for, a different response. Yes, I thought perhaps the hotel might need help, or one of the merchants' wives might want assistance with children. You'll find something, Kale assured her, hating the awkwardness that suddenly stretched between them. You're capable. Faith smiled faintly, high praise from a man of few words. The moment passed, but the conversation lingered in Kale's mind. The prospect of returning to his solitary existence, which had once seemed so essential, now felt strangely empty. Yet what right did he have to ask Faith to stay? What could he offer a young widow and her child beyond a rough cabin and an uncertain future? March brought the first true thaw, and with it, unexpected visitors. Kale was splitting wood when he heard the approach of horses. His hand went instinctively to his sidearm as he watched two riders appear over the ridge. He relaxed slightly when he recognized Jim Thornton and his son Daniel. The older man raised a hand in greeting as they drew near. Pemberton, thought you might have frozen solid in that blizzard back in December. Hadn't seen smoke from your chimney for so long, figured I'd best check once the trail's cleared. Kale stepped forward to greet them. Been occupied, how are things at your place? Lost 2 head to the cold but otherwise made it through. Thornton dismounted, his weathered face creasing in a smile. Daniel here was worried about you, weren't you, boy? The younger Thornton, perhaps 19, grinned sheepishly. Pa exaggerates. Before Kale could respond, the cabin door opened, and Faith emerged with Sarah in her arms, curious about the visitors. Thornton's eyebrows shot up in surprise, and Daniel stared openly. Well now, the older man said, removing his hat. Didn't realize you had company, Pemberton. Kale cleared his throat awkwardly. Jim Thornton, Daniel, this is Faith Oakes and her daughter Sarah. They've been staying with me since the blizzard. Faith, the Thorntons are my neighbors to the south. Faith stepped forward with a warm smile. It's a pleasure to meet you both. Kale has mentioned you. Thornton cast a knowing look at Kale before turning his attention to Faith. The pleasure is ours, ma'am. Been telling this one for years he needs more than horses for company. It's not like that, Kale said quickly. Faith's husband died in the storm. I found her and the baby stranded. They've been here until the weather cleared enough to travel. Faith's smile faltered slightly, and Kale immediately regretted his hasty explanation. I see, Thornton said, his expression sobering. Sorry for your loss, Mrs. Oakes. Thank you, Faith replied quietly. Your neighbor has been extremely kind to take us in. An awkward silence fell, broken when Faith invited the Thorntons inside for coffee. As they moved toward the cabin, Kale found himself walking alongside Daniel, who leaned close to murmur, She's mighty pretty, Pemberton. Kale shot him a warning glance. She's a widow in need of help. That's all. Daniel raised his hands in surrender, just an observation. Inside, Faith served coffee with a natural grace that made the humble cabin seem almost refined. Thornton, clearly charmed, engaged her in conversation about conditions in the area and news from town. Elk Ridge is booming since they struck that new silver vein, the older man explained. New businesses opening, families moving in. They've even started building a proper school. Faith's eyes brightened at this. A school, that's wonderful news. Town's changing, Thornton continued, getting more civilized. Why, they've even got a real church now, not just the preacher holding services in the hotel dining room. I'd love to attend a proper service, Faith said wistfully. It's been months. Well, spring's here, Thornton replied. Trails will be clear enough soon. You should both come to town with us next Sunday. Kale, who hadn't set foot in a church in years, shifted uncomfortably, but seeing the hope in Faith's eyes, he found himself nodding. We might do that. The Thorntons stayed for another hour before taking their leave. As Kale walked them to their horses, Jim held back a moment. That's a fine woman, the older man said quietly. She is, Kale agreed cautiously. Looking to move on when spring comes, is she? Kale nodded, focusing on adjusting Thornton's saddle strap. Wants to find work in town, make her own way. Thornton studied him thoughtfully. And you're just going to let her go? Kale looked up sharply. Not my place to let her do anything. She's free to choose her own path. Of course she is, Thornton agreed mildly. Just wondering if you've considered offering her a reason to stay. She's in mourning, Kale said stiffly. Lost her husband not 3 months ago. I'm not suggesting you court her tomorrow, Thornton replied. But I've known you 7 years, Pemberton. Never seen you look at anyone the way you look at her when you think no one's watching. Kale turned away, unable to deny the observation but unwilling to acknowledge it. Safe journey home, he said, effectively ending the conversation. As he watched them ride away, Kale wrestled with emotions he'd spent years suppressing. Thornton's words had given voice to thoughts he'd barely allowed himself to consider, that perhaps Faith and Sarah had become more to him than just temporary guests. That perhaps the life he'd built alone was not the only life worth living. But the idea of opening himself to such vulnerability, of risking the pain that inevitably came with attachment, filled him with a dread deeper than any physical danger he'd faced. When he returned to the cabin, Faith was humming softly as she cleared away the coffee cups. She looked up as he entered, her expression tentative. They seem like good people, she said. Kale nodded. Jim's been a decent neighbor. Fair man. Faith hesitated, then asked, Did you mean what you said about going to church on Sunday? If you'd like to go, we'll go, he replied simply. Her smile was like sunrise after a long night. I would like that very much. Sarah should be properly christened, and I've missed the comfort of worship. Kale nodded, not trusting himself to speak. The happiness on her face stirred something in him, a desire to be the cause of that joy again and again. The thought terrified him almost as much as it appealed to him. Sunday arrived clear and mild, a perfect early spring day. Kale rose before dawn, spending extra time ensuring his appearance was presentable. He trimmed his beard, donned his least-worn shirt, and even attempted to tame his unruly dark hair. Faith, too, had made efforts with her limited wardrobe. She wore her blue dress, freshly washed and pressed, and had arranged her brown hair in an elegant knot at the nape of her neck. Sarah was wrapped in a clean blanket, her tiny face bright and alert. "You look nice," Kale said awkwardly as they prepared to leave. Faith's cheeks colored slightly. "Thank you, so do you." The ride to Elk Ridge took nearly 2 hours. As they crested the final hill, the town came into view, a collection of wooden buildings strung along a main street with new construction visible at several points. Faith drew in an appreciative breath. "It's bigger than I expected," she remarked. "So many people." Kale nodded, already feeling uncomfortable at the prospect of crowds. He rarely visited town except for absolute necessities, preferring the solitude of his ranch. But seeing the wonder on Faith's face made his discomfort seem a small price to pay. They arrived as the church bell was ringing, joining the stream of people entering the simple white building. Inside, the church was bright and airy, with sunlight streaming through plain glass windows. The pews were filled with families and couples, with a few single men scattered throughout, most likely miners or cowboys from the surrounding area. Their entrance drew curious glances. Kale was known but seldom seen, and Faith, with her quiet beauty and infant daughter, naturally attracted attention. They found seats near the back, where Kale could maintain a clear view of the exits, a habit born of years of caution. The service was simple but heartfelt. The preacher, a young man with an earnest demeanor, spoke of renewal and rebirth, themes appropriate to the season. Faith listened intently, occasionally glancing down at Sarah with such love that Kale found himself watching mother and child more than paying attention to the sermon. Afterward, as the congregation dispersed, several people approached to introduce themselves to Faith. Kale stood slightly apart, uncomfortable with the socializing but unwilling to leave Faith's side. He noticed how naturally she conversed with strangers, how genuinely interested she seemed in their lives and concerns. "Your wife has a gift for making friends," observed a voice beside him. Kale turned to find the preacher, hand extended. "Pastor Michael Collins." "Kale Pemberton," he replied, shaking the offered hand and not bothering to correct the man's assumption. "And yes, she does." The pastor smiled. "I haven't seen you at services before." "Don't come to town much," Kale said simply. "Well, you're always welcome," Collins assured him, "both of you." He glanced toward Faith, who was now speaking with an older woman. She mentioned wanting to have the baby christened. Kale nodded, feeling suddenly out of his depth. Her husband died this winter. Storm caught them on the trail. "I found them, took them in." Understanding dawned in the pastor's eyes. "I see, a charitable act." "Just did what anyone would," Kale muttered uncomfortably. Collins gave him a knowing look. "In my experience, Mr. Pemberton, what seems obvious to one person often never occurs to another. Your kindness gave that young woman and her child a chance at life." Before Kale could respond, Faith rejoined them, Sarah fussing slightly in her arms. "Pastor Collins, this little one is letting me know it's time to find somewhere quiet," she said with a smile. "Of course," the pastor replied, "but before you go, we should arrange a time for the christening." "Perhaps next Sunday." Faith's face lit up. "That would be wonderful, thank you." As they left the church, several townspeople called out invitations for Faith to visit or take tea. By the time they reached their horse, it was clear she had made a favorable impression on Elk Ridge's inhabitants. "They seem like good people," Faith remarked as Kale helped her mount. "Mrs. Buchanan mentioned they need help at the general store since her arthritis has worsened, and Mrs. Thornton invited us to dinner next week." Kale nodded, noting how she had seamlessly included him in these new social connections. "Found yourself work prospects already, I see." Something in his tone must have betrayed his mixed feelings, for Faith gave him a searching look. "Does that bother you, my making plans to stay in the area?" "No," Kale said quickly, mounting behind her. "It's good you should have options." They rode in silence for a while, Sarah dozing against Faith's chest. The spring sunshine warmed the land around them, coaxing new green shoots from the soil and buds from the trees. A season of renewal, as the pastor had said. "Kale," Faith said finally, her voice soft but determined, "I need to ask you something." He tensed, sensing the importance of whatever she was about to say. "Go ahead." "These past months with you," she hesitated. "You've shown such kindness to Sarah and me, but sometimes I wonder if we've overstayed our welcome, if you're eager to return to your solitude." Kale's hands tightened on the reins. "You haven't overstayed," he said carefully, "but you've built your life around being alone," Faith persisted, "and we've disrupted that." "It's been," he searched for the right words, "it's been different." "Not bad different." Faith turned slightly to look at him, her hazel eyes searching his face. "What are you saying, Kale?" The moment stretched between them, fraught with unspoken possibilities. Kale felt as though he stood at the edge of a precipice, knowing that his next words could change everything, for better or worse. "I'm saying," he began slowly, "that I've gotten used to having you both around, that the cabin feels right with you in it." Faith's expression softened. "Are you asking us to stay?" "I'm saying I wouldn't mind if you did," Kale replied, his heart hammering in his chest. "But I understand if you need to make your own way. If you want a different life than what I can offer." "And what life is that?" Faith asked quietly. "What exactly are you offering Kale Pemberton?" Kale swallowed hard. "I'm not Nathan, I know that. I'm not good with fancy words or promises. But I can offer you and Sarah safety, security, a home, and—" he paused, gathering courage, "and care, more than care if you wanted it, if you gave me time." Faith's eyes glistened with unshed tears. "Are you saying you have feelings for me?" "I'm saying I never expected to feel anything for anyone again," Kale admitted, the words coming easier now that he'd begun. "Then you arrived and everything changed. But I know it's too soon after Nathan. I know you need time to grieve, to decide your own path." Faith was quiet for so long that Kale began to regret his candor. But when she finally spoke, her voice was steady and clear. "Nathan will always have a place in my heart. He gave me Sarah, and for that alone I will always love him." She took a deep breath. "But I also believe he would want us to be happy, to be safe. And these months with you have shown me what kind of man you are, Kale, honorable, kind, stronger than you know." "Faith, let me finish," she said gently. "I don't know what the future holds. But I do know that when I think about leaving the Double P, about not seeing you each morning across the breakfast table, or hearing your footsteps on the porch each evening, my heart aches in a way that has nothing to do with grief for Nathan." Hope and emotion Kale had almost forgotten, unfurled in his chest. "So you'll stay, at least for now?" Faith smiled, the expression transforming her face. "Yes, we'll stay, and we'll see where this path leads us day by day." Kale nodded, unable to express the relief and joy that flooded through him. Instead, he did something entirely out of character. He reached around Faith to take her hand, squeezing it gently in wordless promise. The weeks that followed brought changes to the Double P that transformed both the ranch and its occupants. With Faith and Sarah now a permanent presence, Kale found himself making improvements he'd long neglected. He expanded the garden, built proper furniture to replace his makeshift pieces, and began planning an addition to the cabin. Faith, secure in her place, blossomed. She established connections with the women of Elk Ridge, occasionally riding into town with Kale for church or supplies. She took on some work mending for the general store, which she could do from home while caring for Sarah. The extra income, modest though it was, gave her a sense of contribution to their shared life. Sarah's christening, performed by Pastor Collins on a brilliant May morning, became a celebration that drew neighbors and new friends alike. Kale, standing awkwardly in his Sunday best, found himself unexpectedly moved as the pastor blessed the child and welcomed her into the community of faith. "She needs godparents," Collins had explained, "people who will guide her spiritual growth and care for her should anything happen to her mother." To Kale's surprise, Faith had immediately named him and Mrs. Thornton. When he'd questioned her choice later, she'd smiled and said simply, "You've already proven what kind of guardian you would be. I trust no one more." Their relationship developed with cautious tenderness. Kale, respecting Faith's period of mourning, made no romantic overtures beyond occasionally taking her hand or offering a gentle touch on the shoulder. Faith, in turn, showed her growing affection through small gestures, a special meal prepared with care, a mended shirt with subtle embroidery added to the collar, the way she would sit beside him in the evenings, close enough that their shoulders sometimes touched. By mid-June, when summer settled fully over the Colorado foothills, the transformation of the Double P was remarkable. The once Spartan cabin now bore all the hallmarks of a true home: curtains at the windows, a handmade quilt on the bed, which Kale still relinquished to Faith and Sarah, continuing to sleep on his bedroll despite Faith's protests, wildflowers in a jar on the table. More significant was the change in Kale himself. The rigid solitude that had defined him for so long gradually softened. He found himself engaging more with neighbors, even occasionally joining in community events. When he smiled, something that happened with increasing frequency. The expression transformed his face, revealing the younger, less hardened man he might have been without the tragedies of his youth. On a warm evening in late June, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the distant mountains in gold and crimson, Faith broke a comfortable silence. "Kale," she said thoughtfully, "do you ever think about what the Double P could become?" He glanced at her, noting how the fading light caught the auburn highlights in her brown hair. "How do you mean?" "I mean, do you have dreams for this place, beyond what it is now?" Kale considered the question. For years, his only goal had been survival and independence. The idea of aspiring to more had seemed foolishly optimistic in a world he knew to be harsh and unforgiving. But now, with Faith beside him and Sarah growing stronger each day, he found himself considering possibilities he'd never allowed before. "Could run more cattle," he said slowly. "Land could support it, maybe breed horses eventually, good money in that if done right." Faith nodded, encouraging him to continue. "Could expand the cabin properly. Add rooms," he hesitated, then added, "make it a real house for a family." Faith's hand found his on the porch railing. "I'd like that," she said softly, "a real house, a family." Kale turned to face her, heart pounding. "Faith, I know it hasn't been that long since Nathan. If you need more time." "Kale," she interrupted gently, "I will always honor Nathan's memory, but I've made my peace with his passing. And these past months have shown me that life can offer second chances at happiness." She squeezed his hand. "If you're willing to take that chance with me." For answer, Kale reached out to touch her cheek, his calloused fingers infinitely gentle. When she leaned into his touch, he slowly, carefully bent to press his lips to hers in a kiss that held both tenderness and promise. When they separated, Faith's eyes shimmered with emotion. "I never expected to find love again," she whispered. "Especially not in the middle of a blizzard." Kale smiled, the expression now coming naturally to him. "Guess the frontier isn't quite as lonely as I thought." In that moment, with the woman he loved beside him and the future stretching before them like the vast Colorado sky, Kale Pemberton finally understood what he'd been missing all those years of self-imposed isolation. Not just companionship or comfort, but purpose beyond mere survival. The chance to build something lasting, to create a life worth living despite the hardships and dangers of the frontier. The Double P had been his sanctuary, his retreat from a world that had shown him its cruelest face. Now, with Faith and Sarah, it would become something far more valuable, a home in the truest sense of the word. As the last light faded from the sky and the first stars appeared, Kale Pemberton silently thanked whatever fate or providence had sent him riding through a blizzard that December day. The man who had once believed the frontier was no place for love had found, against all expectations, that love was precisely what the frontier needed most. By September, Faith Oaks had become Faith Pemberton in a simple ceremony performed by Pastor Collins in the Elk Ridge Church. The entire community turned out for the occasion, celebrating not just the union of two people but the formation of a new family. Sarah, now nearly a year old and taking her first tentative steps, charmed everyone with her bright smile and curious nature. The double P flourished under their combined care. The cabin expansion Kale had planned was completed before winter, adding 2 proper bedrooms and a larger kitchen. Faith's garden provided abundant vegetables, and Kale's hunting and trading had secured their stores for the coming cold months. That winter, as snow once again blanketed the Colorado foothills, Kale often found himself standing in the doorway of their home, watching Faith with Sarah by the fire, overwhelmed by the fullness of his heart. The man who had once embraced solitude as protection now understood that true strength came not from isolation, but from the bonds of love and family. And when the blizzards came, howling around their sturdy walls, Cale Pemberton held his wife and daughter close, grateful beyond words for the storm that had brought them to his door and changed his life forever.